Hello everybody, this is episode 3 of my Roblox scripting tutorial, and today we will be learning quite a lot. For today's agenda, we will be learning how to use functions, learning the new input context, creating our first global user interface, also known as GUI, and we will also be learning some basic client-to-server replication. So with all that said, let's get started. First thing we're going to do is we're going to create a folder inside of the starter GUI. This folder we're going to name inputs. It's very important that you put all of your input context into a nice clean location so you know exactly where to find it later. We're going to create an input context. We'll name this brick spawning. Next, we'll want to create all of our input actions. We're going to have 2 in total. First one's going to be client brick spawn. The next one's going to be server brick spawn. Now we'll have to set up our bindings for these actions. We will create an input binding. The input bindings is where we store the keys that need to be pressed or the buttons that need to be pressed in order for that action to get called. For now, we will just call this one keyboard, and we will set its key code to E. We'll do the exact same thing for server, but instead of E, we'll have F. Now that we have the input context set up, we can create a local script inside of starter player scripts. Inside of the script, we're going to want to access the player's GUI. Note, the starter GUI and the player GUI are 2 separate things. The starter one is the default information of the GUI, and the player GUI is everything to that specific player. So the way we do this is we're going to want to do local players equals game get service players. Next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to get the player. Now the way we get the player on the client end is you do local player is equal to players.localPlayer. This will get the current player that you're playing as. Now with that done, we can actually get the player GUI. The way you get the player GUI is you do your player.player GUI. We're going to go ahead and set this as a variable. Alright, now that we have the player GUI, we can now access this input context. The way you do this is you do player GUI.inputs.brick spawning. We're going to want to set this as a variable. Now we need to get our input actions. We have 2 of them, client brick spawning and server brick spawning. Alright, I just now realized something. If a script is running inside of starter player scripts and you try getting something inside the starter GUI, one thing you should know is that this script will always run before all of this is loaded. So we are going to want to wait until inputs is loaded. So right here, we will delete that. We'll put a colon and we'll put wait for child and then the name of that input folder. What this will do is we will get the player GUI and we will wait until the inputs folder is loaded, and then after that we will continue on with grabbing the brick spawning and everything else down the line. Alright, now we can get on to creating our very first function. The way you start a function is you do local function, your function name, and then parentheses. We will be calling this spawnbrick_client. Once you have your parentheses down, inside of these parentheses you can type in any arguments you want. For a good example, if I do var1, whenever I call this function, I can do spawnbrick_client and then pass in whatever I want that var to be. Here's an example. What this will do is when this gets called, we pass in hello, and then it will print hello. For now, we're going to want to spawn a brick. The way you do this is you do instance.new part. We're going to want to set this as a variable. Now that we have a part, we can actually customize it how we want. For now, I'm going to name it the client brick. I'm also going to set its color to a nice green color. Alright, these next 2 steps are required. You're going to want to first change the position of this brick so that it does not spawn under the world. I'm going to make this brick spawn high up in the air so that we can see it as it falls down. Last thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to set the parent to the workspace, because right now it does not have any parent, so therefore you will not be able to find it in game. By setting the parent to workspace, it will be visible inside of this area. Now we have our function created. What this will do is every single time this function is called, it will create a brick, name it the client brick, change its color to a green color, change its position to 0, 20, 0, and set it into the workspace. Also, we can remove this var1. Alright, now we need a way of detecting whenever the player clicks E on their keyboard, it will call this function. The way we do this is we do client brick spawn dot pressed. This dot pressed is an event. Every single time any of the keybinds under this input action is pressed, it will call whatever function you have connected to it. The way we connect the function is we do call and connect and then your function name. Now we can finally test this out. Alright, every time we click E, a brick will spawn and fall down, and a bunch of nice green bricks. But now we run into a problem. If you go over here, click drop down servers and clients and add 2 clients, we will notice something. We'll notice that if I try spawning a brick on this client, it spawns in, but not over here. If I try spawning in one over here, it spawns in, but not on the other client. Now how do we fix this? We fix this by doing something called client to server replication. Let's go back to our local script and let's create a new function. Inside of this function, we're going to want to send a signal to the server telling it to spawn a brick. The way we do this is over in replicated storage, we will create a new folder and call it remotes. And we will create a remote event inside it and we'll call it spawn brick. Now this is where things get a little bit more tricky because now we can't do any of the coding on that earlier script. We're going to want to create a server script inside of server script service. Inside of the script, we're going to want to do local replicated storage game get service replicated storage. Now that we have replicated storage, what this will do for us is that it will give us this position in this hierarchy. Now we can go ahead and get the spawn brick event. Now that we have our event, we can create a new function which will spawn the brick on the server. Anything spawned on the server will be replicated to all clients, meaning it is visible and interactable by all clients. With this new spawn brick function, we can go and copy our code from earlier. And instead of client brick, it's going to be server brick, and instead of it being the color green, we'll make it the color blue. Alright, now we need a way of detecting whenever the client sends information to the server telling it to spawn a brick. The way we do this is we access the remote event. Sorry, I just now realized you need to make sure these two are not named the same thing. So to fix this, right here we're going to do RE underscore, so that stands for remote event spawn brick. Now how will we actually detect when the signal is sent from the client to the server telling it to spawn a brick? Well, we will access our remote event by doing RE spawn brick. With this, we can now do dot on server event. This is another event just like before with the dot pressed. The way we set it up to connect it with the function is we will do call and connect, our function name. Now whenever this event activates, it will call this function. Alright, now we can go back to our local script. Up at the top, let's get our replicated storage. Now we need to get our remote event. Now that we have our event, we can actually fire the event from the client. Inside of our function, we will do RE spawn brick fire server. Right here is where you can pass in any parameters, but we do not need to pass in any. Last thing we need to do is that when the input action is called, we need to call this function spawn brick underscore server. I'll let you figure out how to do that. Alright, hopefully that was enough time. The way you do this is you will do your server brick spawn dot pressed connect spawn brick server. Alright, now when the selected key is pressed, it will then call this function and fire this event. Let's test this out. Alright, now that we're in here, if we click E on this client, it'll spawn a bunch of green bricks. If we click F, it'll spawn a bunch of blue bricks on both. If we go on this side, click E, spawns a bunch of client bricks, but not spawning on the other side. And if we click F, spawns a bunch of servers. Now we actually have bricks that spawn on both client and server, and some that only spawn on the selected client. Alright, but I told you earlier, how are we going to implement this with a GUI? Well, it's actually fairly simple. We're first going to want to set up our GUI. Inside of Starter GUI, we're going to want to create a screen GUI. This is the base for every bit of GUI you're going to have in your game. We're going to call this brick spawning. Inside of this, we're going to want to have a frame. A frame, you can think of it as a container or a base color object. We're going to call this buttons because it's going to contain all the buttons for our input actions. First thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to set the anchor points to 0.5 and 1. What this will do is it will put the anchor point of this object halfway on the x-axis and all the way bottom on the y-axis. Now we're going to want to change its position. If you scroll down under position, you have 4 numbers. You're always going to want to use the first number and the third number because those are relative to the screen size and position. For this, we are going to want to put 0.5 and 0.9. This means it will be halfway in the middle on the x-axis and 0.9 of the way down on the y-axis. Now we're going to want to change the size. The size autofills with a absolute position. We're going to want to make it relative. So go ahead and just type in 0. And we're going to want to change the size to 0.3 and 0.1. We now have our areas for the buttons. We can go and scroll up and set the background transparency to 1. Now we're going to want to add a UI list inside of our frame. What this UI list layout will do is it will lay out all the other items inside of the frame in an evenly spaced out order. We're going to want to make this a horizontal fill direction. And we're also going to want to set the horizontal alignment to center and the vertical alignment to center. Now we can actually create our buttons. Let's go ahead and create one button for now, a text button. We'll call this Spawn Brick Server. In here we can set the background color to whatever you like. I'm going to set to blue to match my brick color. And if you scroll all the way down, you can change the text inside. So I'm going to change mine to Spawn Server Brick. I'm also going to make the color of the text white. Lastly, this text scaled option will scale any of your text to the biggest size it can be. I'm also going to change the font size, to make it a bit more pretty. Now after all that, you're going to want to change the size of the object, because as you can see, it's not directly filling up the entire frame. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to set the size to 0.5 and 1, so that fills up on the y-axis and only halfway on the x-axis. Now we can create our client brick spawn button. We can duplicate this, rename it to Spawn Brick Client, and we can also change the text inside to Spawn Client Brick. We also might want to change the background color to make it easier to understand. I'm going to make my green. Now that we have our buttons, we can bind these to the input actions. The way you do this is you will create an input binding inside your client brick spawn action. We're going to call this input binding touch. Lastly, inside of this input binding, you want to keep the key code as unknown, and for UI button, select this and choose the designated button. For this one, I'm doing the client, so we're going to choose the client button. I'm going to duplicate this and put one into the server and do the same, but with the server button. Now we have these buttons binded to a certain action. We can test this out. Alright, now that we're in game, we can actually test these buttons. So I'm going to spawn a few server bricks, and look at that. I'm also going to spawn a few client bricks. It's doing amazing. Let's try the other client. Boom, and boom. Congratulations, you have now built your first system that uses functions, events, input context, and client to server replication. You now have the ability to create some multiplayer games. In the next few videos, we're going to be creating our very first clicker game. I love teaching clicker games for these types of tutorials because they are fairly simple along the way, but they can get complicated if you want to grow it that big. The reason I'm going to be teaching a clicker game is because it is a great way to stick with the basics, but if you want to, in clicker games, you can get pretty advanced with the type of stuff you have to code. Thank you for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe. If you have any questions or suggestions, please join my Discord where I'm almost always online. I hope to see you guys tune in next video. Thanks and good luck.